What if the body you carry, the face you see reflected in the mirror, is not the product of endless millions of years of refinement, but the fossilized shape of a species that stopped changing long before history even began? What if the version of humanity we accept as normal is only the last surviving mask of a lineage that nearly vanished in a single generation, when the sky darkened, the ground froze, and the world itself seemed to reject our existence? The story you learned of slow evolution, of steady progress, of a species climbing its way toward intelligence is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper truth: that humanity, as it exists today, was sculpted not by triumph, but by catastrophe, not by strength, but by desperation. Our form, our fragility, our uncanny sameness across continents. These are the fingerprints of a moment when almost every human on Earth died, and the few who survived carried forward a frozen blueprint that would never again be reshaped by nature's hand. Imagine the last bands of survivors watching the sky turn from blue to ash gray, the sun fading behind a veil of volcanic dust so thick it muted entire seasons. Imagine walking across a land stripped of color and warmth, where the air tasted metallic and the horizon shimmered with the quiet violence of a world in collapse. That silence, that fear, that long winter carved itself into us, into the bones of the species we became. And from that narrow ledge above extinction, something awakened in the human mind that would change everything forever. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. If you were to stand at the edge of a quiet forest at dawn, listening to birdsong and watching mist coil around the trees, you might feel as if the world has been this way forever. You might even imagine that humanity emerged into a world much like this, gentle, rhythmic, predictable. But the truth is that the world our ancestors faced 70,000 years ago was nothing like the one we know. It was a place suspended between warmth and ice, a planet that seemed almost uneasy beneath its own skin. And into that tension, into that fragile balance, stepped a catastrophe so vast it nearly erased our species before we even had the chance to begin. To understand who we are today, and why we haven't changed physically for almost 100,000 years, you have to walk back into that moment. Not with the eyes of a scientist reading data, but with the eyes of someone who lived through the longest winter the Earth had seen in nearly 2 million years. Before the ash and the cold came, humans were scattered across Africa like faint stars in a dark sky, small groups moving through river valleys, hunting in savannas, foraging along the coasts. They were clever, but not yet exceptional. Their tools were simple, stone flaked into sharp edges, shaped by instinct and repetition more than by innovation. Their languages were growing more complex, but still lacked the vast symbolic range they would develop much later. Their bodies, though, were strikingly familiar. If one of them were to step beside you now, stripped of their animal skins and cleaned of dust, you would not mistake them for anything less than fully human. The silhouette of their skull, the proportions of their limbs, the quiet intelligence in their eyes, they were modern in ways that no other animal had ever been. That in itself is a mystery. Evolution rarely pauses. Yet somehow, Long before humanity changed the world, our bodies had already taken on the shape they would keep for tens of thousands of years. In their world, daily life was a delicate negotiation with nature. Rainfall determined where game migrated. Seasons dictated which plants could be eaten. Knowledge passed from elders to children like a thread, holding a small community's survival together. Hunger was frequent but manageable. Danger lurked in predators, illness, and misjudgment. But it was a familiar kind of danger, the type their ancestors had faced for countless generations. And then the sky betrayed them. Far across the ocean, on the island of Sumatra, a mountain called Toba woke with a violence so overwhelming it defies imagination. Modern catastrophes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, are tiny compared to what happened there. Toba did not simply erupt. It exploded with a force that ripped the mountain open, hurling ash so high it mingled with the thin air where the planet curves gently toward space. The debris billowed outward in a plume that spread like a dark halo, carried by global winds that respected no boundaries. What began as a local cataclysm transformed into a planetary event. At first, our ancestors would have seen signs they couldn't interpret. Sunsets deepening into unnatural crimson, the air thickening with a haze that filtered sunlight into a dull, cold glow. Days dimmed. Nights grew sharper. The rhythm of the planet faltered. Plants that once sprouted easily struggled. Animals grew lean, their movements unpredictable, their migration routes disrupted by the shifting climate. The wind carried fine ash that settled on everything, blending with morning dew, leaving a faint grit on the tongue. The familiar world unraveled slowly, then all at once. When the volcanic winter set in, it did not come with a single dramatic moment. It came like a shadow creeping across the land, deepening each day. Temperatures dropped. The rains shifted. The earth hardened in places where it had once been soft and fertile. For humans living then, it must have felt as though the sun itself was abandoning them. Firelight flickered off gaunt faces as families huddled close to survive nights that seemed to stretch longer with each passing season. Hunger carved itself into their bones, and through it all, the sky remained a dull sheet of gray, refusing to reveal the stars. In such times, survival becomes a razor's edge. Groups that had thrived for generations found themselves wandering landscapes that no longer obeyed their understanding. Rivers dried or shifted. Plants died before they could be harvested. Game animals migrated so far that entire hunting strategies collapsed. Many groups likely vanished quietly, their last footprints blown away by cold winds. Others may have clung to shrinking pockets of habitable land, refugia, where the worst effects of the volcanic winter were softened by coastlines or geography. But the margin for error was razor thin. When modern scientists examine human DNA, they find an echo of that ancient narrowing. A genetic bottleneck so severe that the diversity you see in humans today is less than that of some species with only a fraction of our population. This is not the signature of a thriving species. It is the mark of a species that nearly died. All 8 billion people alive today descend from a remarkably small number of survivors, perhaps only a few thousand, whose endurance carried the human story into the future. Their triumph wasn't grand or heroic in the ways we might imagine. It was a day-by-day persistence, a refusal to disappear, a stubborn flicker of life in the face of a collapsing world. The strange thing is that the catastrophe should have ignited rapid evolution. In a population reduced to tiny numbers, natural selection often operates with extraordinary intensity. Traits that confer even a small advantage spread quickly. Genetic shifts appear in dramatic arcs across generations, but when the ice and ash finally loosened their grip and humanity began to grow again, something unexpected happened. Our bodies did not change in new directions. They did not adapt to the cold years. They did not evolve thicker layers of fat, or differently shaped skulls, or specialized teeth, or any of the physical features you might expect from a species reborn from crisis. Instead, our bodies remained almost exactly what they had been before the winter. It was as if the blueprint of humanity had been set in stone, locked into place by the narrow thread of survivors who repopulated the world. We carry that imprint within us still. The reason a fossilized skull from 30,000 or 50,000 years ago looks so much like ours is because it should. That skull belongs to the same template, the same design that passed through the bottleneck almost unchanged. Yet something else did change, something more profound than bone or muscle. When the world grew harsh, human survival began to hinge not on physical traits, but on innovation, cooperation, and imagination. Groups that shared knowledge survived better than those that didn't. Bands that developed new tools, new strategies, new ways of hunting or foraging carved a path through the chaos. Those who relied solely on instinct, the slow, biological kind of adaptation that evolution had provided, were left behind. This shift echoed in everything humans touched. Tools that once changed at a glacial pace suddenly evolved in bursts of creativity. Stone blades became sharper, more refined. Materials were selected with care, shaped with intention. Early signs of symbolic thought, engravings on ochre, beads made from shells, began to appear, hinting at minds capable of abstraction, memory, and meaning beyond pure survival. The pressure of the volcanic winter didn't sculpt new bodies, it sculpted new minds. After Toba, the landscape of human evolution shifted. No longer were we creatures shaped by the slow grinding of natural selection. We became creatures shaped by culture, by ideas passed through stories, by lessons taught beside fires, by strategies refined with each generation. Where evolution had once carved changes into bone and flesh, now innovation carved changes into behavior. The body stopped evolving because it no longer needed to. The mind stepped forward to take its place. As the climate recovered and the skies slowly regained their clarity, humanity emerged from the bottleneck with something unprecedented: the ability to adapt without changing physically. If a region grew colder, we built better shelters or crafted warmer clothing. If prey animals became elusive, we invented new hunting tools or studied their patterns more carefully. If landscapes shifted, we moved with them, carrying our knowledge like a portable survival kit. Evolution had always required millions of years to reshape a species, but culture could reshape humanity in a single lifetime. The world our ancestors walked after the winter was both familiar and transformed. Forests regrew, rivers flowed again, the air warmed. But the humans who stepped into this renewed world carried a new kind of power, an ability to survive not through biological change, but through shared understanding. That power spread through language, through cooperation, through stories that helped the next generation navigate a world that had once tried to extinguish them. From those small pockets of survivors, grew the vast tapestry of humanity we see today. Yet beneath the diversity of our cultures, our languages, our histories, lies a striking sameness in our bones, a quiet reminder of a moment when the world pressed us to the brink, and only a narrow thread of us made it through. Our bodies are the preserved shapes of those survivors. Our creativity is the inheritance of their desperate innovation. Our sameness is the fossil imprint of a species reborn from scarcity. And our differences, linguistic, cultural, imaginative, are the flowering of a mind that learned to outrun evolution. In that sense, every one of us is a living monument to the moment the sky dimmed and the earth grew cold. We are shaped by a disaster that nearly erased our story. We are the descendants of those who adapted not by changing their bodies, but by changing their understanding. And the echo of that choice, forced upon them by ash and hunger, still lives in everything we do, from the tools we build to the stories we tell. The volcanic winter ended long ago, but the evolutionary winter it triggered remains. Our form has stayed frozen in time, even as our minds blaze forward. In the shadow of that ancient catastrophe, humanity became something the world had never seen before. A species whose greatest adaptation was not in flesh, but in thought. The world that emerged after the ash finally thinned was not the same place our ancestors remembered. The sun took on a harder edge. Winds traced unfamiliar paths over plains that had once been rich with grass, now transformed into sparse, shifting landscapes where survival demanded more than instinct. But even as the earth slowly re-warmed, humanity found itself carrying an invisible legacy from the volcanic winter, one that had nothing to do with temperature or sky color. It lived in the architecture of the mind. Something had changed inside those who survived, something subtle but irreversible, a sharpened capacity for imagination, a new precision in perception, a deeper ability to extract meaning from pattern. If the first part of the human story was written in bone, muscle, and instinct, the next chapters would be written in thought. For millions of years before the bottleneck, humans and their close relatives evolved like every other creature on Earth. A mutation offering even a slight advantage in survival or reproduction spread slowly through the population. If a climate shifted toward cold, bodies might adapt through thicker bones or denser muscle. If predators grew more dangerous, brains might grow larger or more efficient. But once the bottleneck passed and the survivors emerged into a world they had to rebuild, these mechanisms became too slow. The crisis had forced humans to rely on learning and cooperation more fiercely than ever, and once the crisis ended, they didn't stop. They leaned into those skills with a momentum that began to reshape their future. Instead of waiting for evolution to sculpt new traits across generations, they sculpted new strategies within lifetimes. You can see this shift reflected in the earliest signs of what scientists call behavioral modernity. Before the bottleneck, stone tools changed so slowly that one generation could pass nearly identical methods to the next for thousands of years. Shapes that worked were preserved, not improved. But after the Great Winter, the pace quickened. Stone flakes became elongated blades. Crafting techniques grew more refined, demanding deliberate teaching instead of simple imitation. A human who lived before the catastrophe might have recognized the purpose of these tools, but would have marveled at their sophistication, at the precision with which they were shaped, as if made by hands that carried centuries of restless experimentation. Imagine the first child who watched their parent not merely strike stone, but explain why they struck it that way. That child wasn't just learning a task, they were inheriting a structure of understanding. Language, which had been growing in complexity for generations, suddenly found new depths, new functions. Words became more than warnings, requests, or identifications. They became vessels for teaching abstract concepts, how to read the faint impression of a broken twig to follow an animal, how to anticipate the progression of seasons by watching the behavior of birds, how to understand that a stone could be shaped not just by force, but by intention. Every new idea shared became a small victory against the world that had once nearly destroyed them. Language is sometimes described as a tool, but in this period it behaved more like a revolution. It allowed humans to construct shared reality, stories, plans, warnings, and to transmit them quickly enough that knowledge no longer had to die with the old. The elders of a group, once the repositories of hard-earned experience, now became walking archives. A person who lived through a harsh winter or a failed hunt could turn that memory into instruction, helping dozens survive challenges they themselves would never face again. The planet became less a place to endure and more a place to decode, a landscape full of clues waiting to be interpreted by minds capable of weaving information into patterns. Somewhere in this period, art emerged not as decoration, but as expression, an outward gesture of the new depths forming inside the mind. On cave walls, abstract symbols appeared: lines, dots, cross-hatched shapes. To a modern observer, these may seem simple, but simplicity is deceptive. These images were not mere scribbles. They were the earliest attempts to externalize thought. They allowed humans to record, to mark a concept or a memory outside of their own minds. That ability alone, representing something that is not present, something imagined or remembered, was a monumental step in mental evolution. When the first person dragged a piece of ochre across stone, they were doing more than making marks. They were shaping a new dimension of what it meant to be human. Not long after, art blossomed into something more intricate. Beadwork made from shells drilled with precision, patterns carved into bone, pigments mixed deliberately to create varied hues. These objects served purposes beyond survival. They signaled identity, belonging, perhaps even love or grief. They revealed that humans were not merely enduring the world, they were interpreting it, assigning meaning, shaping themselves in ways evolution never anticipated. This is the moment when our species began to carry something intangible yet powerful: culture, an inheritance not tied to genetics, but to memory, creativity, and shared understanding. As culture expanded, so did cooperation. Groups that once moved independently began to form alliances, exchanging knowledge, tools, and even spouses, weaving webs of connection across regions. Instead of evolving biological adaptations to new environments, humans traded the secrets of survival. They shared how to build shelters that resisted wind, how to hunt unfamiliar prey, how to identify plants that could heal or poison. These exchanges acted like accelerators, propelling humans across landscapes that should have taken thousands of years to colonize. Adaptation no longer required mutation, it required information. This shift in survival, from dependent on biology to dependent on culture, produced effects still visible today. Physically, humans remained much the same as they had been for tens of thousands of years. But mentally and socially, they were becoming something unprecedented. The brain didn't grow much larger in size, but it grew in connectivity, in specialization, in the depth of networks that allowed one person's idea to become a community's advantage. A spark in one mind could save dozens. A clever toolmaker could influence generations that would never meet them. Knowledge began to accumulate not through genetic change, but through cultural transmission, each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. Some of the earliest examples of this cumulative learning come from the development of complex hunting strategies. Instead of simply chasing prey, humans learned to coordinate attacks, anticipating animal behavior by reading subtle environmental cues. They learned that driving herds toward cliffs could produce far greater returns than solitary hunts. They established signal systems, calls, gestures, patterns of movement, to ensure that every member of the group played a specific role. These strategies didn't arise from instinct. They arose from communication, from trial and error shared across generations until the best methods prevailed. Fire, too, evolved from a tool of survival into a focal point of community. In the flickering light of flames, stories were told, lessons were given, skills were practiced. Fire extended the day into the night, allowing more time for teaching, planning, bonding. It became the hearth around which identity formed, the center where ideas could be exchanged, debated, preserved. The warmth fire brought was nothing compared to the warmth of shared understanding. In its glow, humans built the early architecture of collaboration. Clothing, another cultural innovation, allowed humans to move into climates their bodies were not evolved to endure. Instead of waiting for biology to produce thicker skin or more fur, they crafted coverings from hides, softened and shaped with bone tools. Each garment represented hours of learning, experimentation, and improvement. And once one group mastered these techniques, they could teach another. In this way, humans bypassed the slow march of natural selection entirely. A child born into a cold region no longer needed a mutation to survive. They needed a teacher. What's remarkable is how consistent the human form remained across this explosion of innovation. From the perspective of physical evolution, the millennia following the bottleneck are a near flat line. The brain size remains within the same narrow range. The proportions of limbs and torso stay the same. Dental structures change only slightly, influenced by diet more than genetics. Across thousands of generations, the human body clung to the same blueprint. But within those constant bodies lived minds that were evolving at a pace no other species could match. This dynamic, stable bodies, accelerating culture, became the foundation for everything humanity would later accomplish. By separating survival from biology, humans unlocked an entirely new evolutionary path, one driven by behavior rather than genes. The implications of this are profound. It means that the species responsible for building cities, crafting poetry, designing spacecraft, and decoding the origins of the universe is built on a physical template forged 70,000 years ago and held in stasis ever since. Our bones belong to the past, but our minds belong to everything that came after. As communities grew stronger, they also grew more inventive. The earliest evidence of long-distance trade after the bottleneck shows that humans were exchanging rare materials, shells, pigments, specific stones, over distances far greater than any single group could traverse regularly. This means groups communicated, met, and traded in cycles that required planning, trust, and shared expectations. A group in one region might specialize in crafting certain tools, while another might gather materials found only on their land. This specialization and distribution of labor are early signs of the social dynamics that would one day grow into economic systems, political alliances, and cultural identities. At the same time, rituals began to take shape, symbolic behaviors that served no direct survival purpose, but strengthened community cohesion. Burials indicate respect for the dead, and perhaps a belief in something beyond the visible world. Decorative objects suggest the desire to communicate status, belonging, or emotion through aesthetics. These practices helped humans bond in ways that transcended immediate survival, creating networks of loyalty and meaning that allowed groups to remain stable even in times of scarcity. And stable groups survive better than scattered individuals. Evolution, once sculpting bodies through physical pressures, was now rewarding the ability to maintain social harmony and shared purpose. As centuries passed, human groups expanded across diverse landscapes, savannas, forests, mountains, coastlines, and instead of evolving distinct anatomical forms suited to each region, they evolved distinct cultures. The differences we see today between societies, languages, traditions, values, technologies, are the true adaptive branches of humanity. They filled the role once occupied by genetic mutation. Instead of a cold climate producing a thicker coat, it produced innovations in shelter and clothing. Instead of a dangerous predator selecting for stronger bodies, it selected for better weapons and more coordinated defense strategies. Instead of dietary challenges favoring digestive mutations, they favored cooking techniques and food processing methods. This shift had another consequence. It blurred the boundary between individuals. In a world where survival depended on shared knowledge more than inherited traits, the importance of community grew exponentially. A child born into a group with advanced tool-making skills had access to a survival advantage they did not earn genetically. Conversely, a child born into a group that lacked certain techniques was disadvantaged regardless of genetic potential. Evolution no longer worked at the level of individuals. It worked at the level of societies. This social evolution produced innovations that spread like waves across regions. When one group discovered a more efficient weapon or a better method for storing food, neighboring groups adopted it. Cultural evolution behaves like fire, leaping from one dry branch to another, fast, unpredictable, transformative. And once the process began, it never stopped. It carried humans into lands where no hominin had ever lived, across deserts and ice fields, over mountains, and eventually oceans. It made us the only species on Earth whose primary adaptation mechanism is not encoded in DNA, but inscribed in knowledge. By the time humans began engraving spirals into stone, carving figurines from mammoth ivory, and painting the walls of ancient caves with images of animals, they were already operating with minds far more flexible than the bodies that housed them. They hunted creatures 10 times their size, navigated vast territories through memory alone, and forged emotional bonds that held them together through winter, hunger, and grief. They were not yet farmers or city builders, but they carried the blueprint of everything that would follow inside their thoughts. In the aftermath of the bottleneck, humanity became a paradox, physically static, mentally explosive. A species frozen in form, but not in possibility. A species whose greatest power lay not in the shape of its bones, but in the shape of its ideas. Everything we are today, the explorers, the builders, the dreamers, grows from the minds of those early survivors, whose imaginations lifted them out of the shadow of extinction. Their bodies may have been the same as ours, but their minds were beginning to unlock a world of infinite potential. We inherited that potential. It is the fire still burning in us, a fire brighter than the volcanic winter that once threatened to extinguish us. By the time humanity began to stretch beyond the African cradle that sheltered the survivors of the volcanic winter, the world had become a vast, restless canvas, harsh in places, bountiful in others, and constantly shifting beneath the weight of climatic cycles. But unlike the hominins who came before, the people stepping into this world carried something new. A mind sharpened by catastrophe, disciplined by scarcity, and empowered by a kind of imagination that could leap thousands of years ahead of evolution's slow, grinding pace. They did not wait for their bodies to adapt to new environments. They adapted the environments themselves, sculpting their future with ideas instead of mutations, and in doing so, they placed humanity on a path that would eventually break the ancient rhythm of natural selection. Picture one of those early journeys, a small band weaving its way north along an unfamiliar coastline. The ocean breathes in long, rhythmic pulses against the rocks, its surface reflecting a sun that still looks a bit too pale after the volcanic winter. The air carries the smell of salt and kelp, and each step forward is a gamble. Every hill might conceal new terrain, new prey, new dangers. But these travelers are not helpless wanderers. They carry with them knowledge inherited not through blood, but through shared experience. Stories of where edible plants might grow, how to shape stone for hunting tools, how to predict weather from the movement of clouds. Even without maps or compasses, they move with a sense of direction that comes from memory woven across generations. The moment humans began pushing into new lands, the mind became the dominant tool of survival. The climate varied dramatically from region to region, some places drenched in rain, others parched by drought, still others locked in cold that would have killed any tropical animal. But humans were no longer merely tropical animals. A brain sculpted by crisis had taught them something extraordinary. If the world changed, they could change their behavior faster than evolution could ever hope to change their bodies. This kind of adaptation is visible in the archaeological record in ways that are almost poetic. Take the earliest signs of long-distance movement of materials. When humans living hundreds of miles inland used shells from distant coasts as ornaments, those shells didn't walk themselves into the desert. They arrived through human hands, passed along networks of travelers, traders, and storytellers. This exchange of objects, useless for survival on their own, points to something deeper: the sharing of ideas. Humans had begun forming social webs larger than any single group. Knowledge no longer lived and died within isolated families. It traveled, growing richer and more complex with each exchange. And yet, through all this movement and innovation, the human form remained astonishingly stable. Fossils from tens of thousands of years ago match the skeletons of modern people with unsettling precision. The skulls from ancient plains and river valleys From deserts and forests, from frozen tundras and temperate woodlands, they all carry the same basic architecture. The same rounded brain case, the same face proportions, the same delicate balance of height and limb length. For a species wandering rapidly into climates no hominin had ever survived before, this stasis is baffling. Nature had always rewarded physical adaptation, but humans were now bypassing that process entirely. One of the biggest forces behind this bypass was fire. Not just the ability to spark it, but the mastery of it. Fire became a tool that expanded the boundaries of viable environments. It allowed humans to inhabit mountainsides where nights dropped below freezing, to cook roots and meats that would otherwise be inedible, and to clear brush from landscapes to encourage the growth of plants they favored. This practice, called controlled burning today, became a way to reshape ecosystems. Hunters could burn grasslands to stimulate new growth and draw grazing animals into predictable feeding areas. Instead of evolving sharper teeth or larger stomachs to digest difficult foods, humans evolved pots, hearths, and cooking stones. A species that relied on culture rather than biology was emerging with every lesson passed down around the fire. The shift from biological to cultural adaptation also transformed our social structures. Earlier, hominins lived in small, loosely organized groups. But after the bottleneck, cooperation became more than an advantage. It became a necessity. Surviving the cold centuries required sharing resources, coordinating hunts, caring for the injured, protecting the weak, and ensuring that children survived long enough to learn. In such environments, antisocial individuals were liabilities. Groups that cultivated empathy and mutual support outlasted groups that didn't. Over time, this created a kind of psychological selection, not for stronger bodies, but for stronger cohesion. These changes weren't accidental. They were responses to conditions no living species had encountered before. The volcanic winter had narrowed humanity to a fragile thread. To maintain that thread, our ancestors needed something new, a kind of collective intelligence. You can see traces of this in the way early humans organized themselves into communities with specialized roles. Some individuals became experts in crafting stone tools. Others became skilled hunters. Others took on knowledge roles, shamans, healers, or memory keepers who preserved stories that taught future generations how to survive. This specialization further detached survival from physical fitness. You didn't need to be the strongest hunter if you were the best toolmaker. You didn't need to be the swiftest runner if you knew where edible plants grew year-round. Skill replaced strength. Knowledge replaced muscle. This shift also produced something else, something that would one day change the planet more profoundly than any volcano. Humans began externalizing their innovation. Instead of relying on genetic memory, they relied on tools. Instead of waiting for evolution to provide sharper senses, they created devices that extended their reach. A simple spear thrower multiplied the force of an arm. A sharpened obsidian blade could slice more cleanly than any tooth. Tools became a way to extend the body, to amplify its abilities without reshaping it genetically. This partnership between mind and material was the dawn of technology. By the time humans reached regions populated by Neanderthals, an older human relative adapted to cold climates. The differences between the groups were not anatomical, they were cultural. Neanderthals had bodies perfectly sculpted for Ice Age Europe, wide chests, powerful limbs, dense bones capable of absorbing massive physical stress. Humans arriving from Africa did not have these traits, yet they thrived in those same harsh regions. How? Not through biological superiority, but through cultural complexity. They crafted layered clothing, built shelters, shaped bone needles, and developed strategies for storing food. These innovations acted like evolutionary shortcuts. The environment demanded physical adaptations, but humans provided behavioral ones instead. The cognitive revolution, this sudden expansion of mental capabilities, re-emerged in new forms across continents. As groups settled into specific territories, their cultural practices adapted to local conditions. In forested areas, humans learned to track sound more acutely, to interpret the faint rustle of animals moving through undergrowth. In deserts, they studied patterns of wind on sand to locate water sources hidden beneath dunes. In tundra regions, they observed the migrations of caribou and the seasonal cycles of ice. But these adaptations didn't change their bodies. They changed their knowledge, and that knowledge could be shared, taught, remembered, refined. This growing gap between biological stasis and cultural acceleration is the defining feature of post-bottleneck humanity. It's why groups separated by oceans and mountains remained anatomically identical even as their cultures diverged wildly. Humans living in ice-bound Siberia, sun-baked Australia, dense rainforests, and bleak deserts all carried the same skeletal template. If evolution had been in charge, each region would have sculpted different forms. But evolution was no longer in charge, not in the old way. Culture had become the new driver. The most striking proof of this lies in the archaeological traces of symbolic behavior, evidence that humans were beginning to operate in a world of meaning, not just necessity. In caves, ochre pigments appear in deliberate patterns, as though someone felt compelled to mark their presence or communicate something beyond survival. Beads made from shells or bones suggest identity, status, or connection. The act of wearing such ornaments signals the creation of social narratives: who belonged, who led, who remembered. These stories weren't written in books. They were written in minds and transmitted through rituals, songs, and the shared glow of the campfire. As humans spread across continents, their expanding imagination produced cosmologies, early forms of belief about how the world worked. Lightning wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was a sign. The movement of stars wasn't merely predictable, it was meaningful. Burials adorned with pigments and tools suggest humans were thinking about life beyond death. This ability to imagine realms outside the physical world was both a survival tool and a spark of something profoundly human: wonder. A species that wonders can innovate endlessly, because wonder pushes the mind to explore what cannot yet be seen. As centuries stretched into millennia, the pace of cultural evolution accelerated. In some regions, humans experimented with shaping stone so precisely that tools became indistinguishable across thousands of miles, evidence of shared traditions or widespread teaching networks. In other regions, hunting techniques evolved from simple pursuit to sophisticated strategies involving traps, ambushes, and teamwork. The earliest musical instruments, a bone flute, hollowed with meticulous care, testify to a different kind of adaptation: emotional cohesion. Music binds communities. It tells stories without words. It soothes fear and strengthens identity. No biological mutation could have invented it. Only imagination could. And still, through all this creativity, the human body remained unchanged. This duality, static body, explosive mind, would shape everything that followed. It set humanity on a trajectory where survival no longer depended on natural selection, but on the accumulation of knowledge. The result was a species that broke the rules of evolution. You can find the most haunting evidence of this in our genetic code. Traits that should have been selected against, poor eyesight, fragile bones, even some chronic diseases, survived because culture compensated for them. The child with weak vision could still contribute if taught to weave baskets or shape tools. The elder with aching joints could preserve stories or guide rituals. The injured hunter could become a mentor. Natural selection, which had once culled the weak without mercy, now found itself outmatched by compassion, cooperation, and shared intelligence. Evolution wasn't halted by biology, it was halted by kindness. This compassion extended the lifespan of individuals who would never have survived alone. Archaeological remains reveal healed fractures, worn joints, and missing limbs. People who lived years beyond the moment nature should have ended their lives. They lived because others fed them, tended them, protected them. And in doing so, humans created something evolution never anticipated: a society in which survival was a collective achievement, not an individual contest. These ancient behaviors formed the blueprint for everything civilization would one day become. The ability to gather specialized skills, share knowledge, form alliances, express symbolic meaning, and care for the vulnerable. All of it grew in the shadow of the volcanic winter and the long recovery that followed. Those pressures carved a mental resilience into humanity that has echoed through every generation since. The migrations that carried humans across continents were not random wanderings. They were purposeful explorations guided by stories, memory, and the confidence that knowledge could overcome the unknown. When humans first stepped into Australia, they faced landscapes full of creatures no African savanna had prepared them for. But they thrived. When they crossed into the Americas, they encountered climates far colder and prey far larger than anything in their ancestral lands. But they adapted. Not through bodies, but through ideas. And so, as the world filled with human footsteps, a strange future took shape. One where the laws of evolution still applied, but no longer defined us. A future where knowledge, not genetics, governed survival. A future where bodies remained ancient even as minds became modern. A future in which humanity would eventually come to dominate the planet, not because evolution made us strong, but because catastrophe made us wise. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. Our bodies belong to the past, frozen in a shape refined before the world truly began to challenge us. But our minds belong to the future, shaped by crisis into engines of endless possibility. And in that split, the ancient form and the restless mind, you can see the moment humanity stepped out of nature's script and began writing its own. As humanity spread across continents, carrying with them the fragile memory of the volcanic winter and the expanding power of their imagination, the world itself became a kind of mirror, a stage that reflected back the growing complexity of the human mind. Every new territory they entered required them not just to endure, but to interpret, to decode the silent logic of landscapes that had never before known human footsteps. In this era, the human story was still written in movement. Each valley, each coastline, each cave etched another layer into the mental architecture of a species becoming increasingly defined by knowledge rather than instinct. But with this expansion came the first hints of something deeper, the beginnings of a pattern that would follow humanity for tens of thousands of years, a tension between the physical world they inherited and the imagined worlds they created. Imagine early humans approaching the towering ice walls of northern Eurasia. The horizon is dominated by a gleaming expanse of white, shimmering under a pale sun. The cold is not a gentle chill. It bites, penetrating cloth and skin, threatening to steal breath from lungs. No tropical animal should survive here, yet humans do. They move through the landscape not because their bodies are adapted to the cold, but because their minds are. They wrap themselves in layered furs, construct shelters from bone and hide, and carve tools capable of extracting food from environments that seem barren to any creature unprepared for such extremes. Their survival is not a miracle of biology, but a triumph of behavior. What they encounter in these new lands challenges their understanding of the world. Herds of mammoths move across the ice like living mountains. Woolly rhinoceroses graze on wind-swept plains. Saber-toothed predators watch from shadows carved by glaciers. These animals are powerful, dangerous, and unfamiliar. Yet the humans who face them are not intimidated in the way a lesser species might be. They have learned to read patterns, migration routes, seasonal changes, animal behaviors, and to turn those patterns into opportunity. Precision hunting techniques evolve. Spears tipped with finely crafted stone blades give humans a reach far greater than their physical limbs allow. Entire communities participate in the hunt, coordinating movements with subtle gestures, shouts, or even song-like rhythms that echo across icy fields. It's here, in this stark environment, that another transformation begins. Humans do not merely observe the world, they begin to mythologize it. The animals they hunt become figures in stories, each possessing a significance larger than their physical presence. A mammoth might symbolize endurance. A lion might embody cunning. A serpent carved onto bone could represent the flow of rivers or the movement of seasons. These symbols, shared across fireside gatherings, do something no genetic mutation ever could. They unify groups through shared meaning. Symbolism, once born, spreads like fire. It enters the design of weapons, the ornaments worn around the neck, the pigments painted on cave walls. It becomes the invisible glue that binds communities into something greater than collections of individuals. You can see this in the way early humans decorated objects that served no practical purpose. Tools were shaped not just for efficiency, but for beauty. Clothing was adorned with beads that clicked softly as the wearer moved. Ritual objects were carved with abstract patterns whose meanings we may never fully understand, but which clearly carried weight among those who made them. This emerging symbolic universe didn't just enrich culture, it reinforced the dominance of the mind over the body. In animals, communication is tied to instinct. In humans, it was becoming tied to imagination. A gesture could signify a story. A pattern carved into wood could represent a lineage. A song could encode instructions for navigating by stars. The body remained the same, but the mind was building structures far beyond anything physical evolution could produce. The extraordinary thing about this period is how much innovation happens in parallel across vast distances. Groups separated by thousands of miles lose genetic contact with one another, yet produce cultural patterns that echo each other. Burials with symbolic objects, complex hunting strategies, art that captures motion and identity. This suggests a deeper shift in cognition. Humans were developing not just new behaviors, but new frameworks of thought. They were learning to categorize, to associate, to imagine. They were becoming storytellers. Consider the cave paintings that would one day be discovered on the walls of Lascaux and Chauvet. When you stand inside those ancient chambers today, the air is thick with silence so deep it feels sacred. The images seem to move in the flickering light, horses galloping, bison charging, lions prowling. These aren't simple drawings. They show perspective, motion, and intention. They reveal minds capable of abstraction, capable of imagining a moment not as it is, but as it could be captured, preserved, and communicated. The people who painted these scenes were not primitive. They were artists, engineers of emotion. The existence of such art raises a profound question. What drove humans to invest time and effort into creating images in places where no one lived? These caves were not dwellings. They were sanctuaries. Reaching their depths required crawling through narrow tunnels, navigating darkness so complete it smothered all sense of direction. Firelight flickering off uneven walls cast shadows that danced like spirits. Perhaps that was the point. These environments created sensory experiences that amplified the symbolic meaning of the art. In such places, stories became rituals, and rituals became belief systems. Belief systems, in turn, became a new kind of adaptation. They helped humans make sense of unpredictable environments. A storm was not random, it was the expression of a force. A poor hunt was not mere misfortune, it was the displeasure of spirits or ancestors. These interpretations weren't errors, they were cognitive tools. They helped maintain social cohesion, distribute emotional burdens, and motivate cooperation. A group that believed misfortune had meaning was more resilient than one that felt abandoned by randomness. This resilience was critical as humans entered some of the harshest environments on the planet. Whether navigating Arctic tundra or deserts baked beneath the relentless sun, they carried not just tools, but stories. Narratives that explained the world and their place within it. These stories shaped behaviors, guided decisions, and provided psychological anchors. In a sense, they were early software running on the unchanging hardware of the human body. What's remarkable is how stable that hardware remained even as humans confronted wildly different challenges. When people settled in tropical rainforests, their bodies did not evolve new features to cope with humidity or disease. Instead, they developed local knowledge, medicinal plants, hunting techniques suited to dense foliage, ways of navigating by sound rather than sight. When humans entered deserts, they didn't grow water-storing organs like camels. They studied wind patterns, dug wells, learned to preserve moisture, and developed rituals around water usage. Everywhere they went, culture stepped in where biology might once have acted. This compensation created an unexpected consequence. The physical human body became a kind of universal template, capable of functioning in any environment as long as the culture provided the necessary adaptations. This universality is part of what allowed humans to expand so rapidly across the globe. No other animal could do this. Even today, species remain locked into the climatic niches where they evolved. But humans broke that rule not because their bodies changed, but because their minds did. This mental expansion led to innovations few could have predicted. One of the most dramatic was the development of social time, an understanding of past and future that extended far beyond immediate experience. Humans began marking the seasons, tracking the movements of stars, predicting the return of animals. They created calendars long before the word existed. These early attempts to understand time were monumental leaps in cognition. Animals react to the world. Humans began anticipating it. Anticipation required memory, and memory required preservation. That's why early symbolic objects are so significant. The carved lines, beads, and painted images weren't just decorations. They were anchors for collective memory. They allowed communities to carry knowledge forward, even when the elders who held it died. This continuity strengthened the cultural scaffolding humans relied on to survive. Every generation inherited not just a body, but a library of ideas. As humans settled into increasingly diverse environments, specialization within groups intensified. Some individuals became experts in reading animal behavior. Others excelled at shaping tools or crafting clothing. Others developed talents for interpreting dreams or leading ceremonies that bound communities together. This division of roles created a collaborative intelligence far greater than the sum of its parts. A community of 30 individuals, each with specialized skills, functioned as a kind of distributed brain. This collective cognition is one of the earliest forms of what scientists today call emergent systems, where the whole is smarter and more adaptable than any individual component. These systems didn't just help humans survive, they helped them flourish. Communities grew more stable, trade routes expanded, innovations passed from group to group like ripples across water. The pace of cultural evolution quickened again, leaving physical evolution far behind. In this era, the human body was no longer the primary battlefield of survival. The battlefield was the mind, the community, the cultural practices that shaped the future. One of the most striking aspects of this period is the interaction between different human species. When modern humans encountered Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic hominins, they didn't merely displace them through violence or competition. They interacted, they exchanged knowledge, they interbred. This blending of lineages added new genetic chapters to the human story. Neanderthal genes provided immunity to certain diseases. Denisovan genes helped some populations thrive at high altitudes. These contributions enriched the human genome without altering the underlying blueprint. They became part of the static body, small notes added to an ancient melody. But the cultural interactions were even more significant. Humans absorbed and adapted useful ideas wherever they found them. They learned new hunting methods from local hominins, adopted techniques for shelter building, and exchanged symbolic practices. This cultural synthesis was yet another reason the human body didn't need to change. Instead of waiting for evolution to provide solutions, humans borrowed them from others or invented them outright. This adaptability led to a profound shift in humanity's relationship with the environment. Instead of being shaped by nature, humans began to shape nature. They cleared land using controlled burns, encouraging the growth of plants they favored. They built pathways that influenced animal movements. They developed early forms of landscape management long before agriculture emerged. These practices transformed ecosystems, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. They altered fire regimes, species distributions, and even the chemical composition of soils. In these moments, the seeds of future civilizations were being planted, not through genes, but through behavior. As the millennia passed, the mental toolkit of humanity continued to expand. The invention of complex tools, the refinement of language, and the deepening of symbolic culture created a feedback loop. New ideas led to new behaviors, which led to new challenges, which in turn demanded new ideas. This cycle accelerated cultural evolution to a pace unimaginable in biological terms. No mutation could spread through a population as fast as a good idea could. This acceleration reached a new threshold when humans began constructing long-term settlements. Even before agriculture, some groups returned to the same seasonal camps year after year, reinforcing social bonds and shared memories tied to specific places. These proto-settlements created the conditions for more stable communities, where innovations could accumulate rapidly without being lost to migration. Tools became more specialized, rituals grew more elaborate, stories lengthened, linking the living to the ancestors and creating a sense of continuity across generations. In these early settlements, you can see the roots of civilization forming like veins beneath the surface. The idea of home, of a fixed place that held meaning beyond immediate survival, was revolutionary. It allowed humans to think in terms of long-term planning. A group could invest in building better structures, cultivating relationships with neighboring groups, or developing sophisticated rituals because they knew they would return to the same place again. These investments paid off in the form of stronger social cohesion and more efficient resource use. By now, the split between biological and cultural evolution was complete. The body remained ancient, essentially the same template that had survived the volcanic winter. But the mind was becoming something else entirely. It was acquiring the ability to imagine futures, to plan years ahead, to invent solutions that reached beyond instinct. This ability would eventually lead to the agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, the birth of writing, and the construction of civilizations. But its beginnings lie here, in the era when humans first learned to bend the world to their will rather than adapt their bodies to its demands. This period also marks the dawn of historical consciousness, the awareness that humans were part of a story that stretched beyond their lifetimes. Burials became more elaborate, suggesting beliefs about continuity after death. Art became more ambitious, capturing not just the world, but the unseen forces within it. Music and dance became ways to reinforce identity and express emotion. In every corner of human life, imagination was taking the reins. The legacy of this era is profound. It explains why humans, unlike any other species, can live in environments far beyond their biological origins. It explains why our bodies remain nearly identical across continents, while our cultures vary dramatically. It explains why humanity eventually rose to dominate the planet, not through strength or speed or specialized anatomy, but through the boundless creativity that emerged from minds shaped by catastrophe. This part of the human story marks the moment when we became more than animals. We became authors of our own destiny. We became creatures whose greatest evolutionary leap happened not in the genome, but in the imagination. And from that moment on, the world would never again be shaped solely by nature. It would be shaped by us. By the time humanity began settling into landscapes that their ancestors had once only passed through, the world was entering a new rhythm. The ice still pressed against the edges of continents in some regions, but elsewhere the earth was warming just enough to soften its grip. Rivers swelled, forests crept outward, grasslands expanded in shimmering waves. This was an era of thresholds, ecological, psychological, and cultural, and humans stood at the center of them, no longer merely adapting to the world, but sensing, perhaps for the first time, that they could influence it. What emerged in this long, slow chapter of our species was not a physical transformation, but a profound reshaping of identity. Humanity began to see itself not as a collection of wandering bands, but as something capable of continuity, memory, and meaning that stretched across generations. In the earliest centuries of this shift, the transformation was subtle. A group would return year after year to the same seasonal camp, drawn by the same migrating herds or the same reliable water source. Over time, the camp became more than a waypoint. It became a place people recognized, a clearing where children learned to walk, a rock ledge where hunters carved marks recording successful kills, a bend in the river where elders told stories under starlit skies. Slowly, land became associated with memory, and memory anchored people in place. These proto-settlements were not permanent villages, but they foreshadowed everything villages would become. Centers of identity, repositories of collective knowledge, hubs of emotional connection. The stability of these places allowed cultural innovation to accelerate. When people stopped moving constantly, even for short periods, they could invest more time in refining tools, experimenting with new techniques, and passing knowledge to the young in more deliberate ways. Skill specialization deepened. A person adept at crafting needles or shaping stone might produce tools for the entire group, freeing others to focus on hunting, gathering, or storytelling. This diversification of roles expanded the mental worlds of those who participated. Instead of living lives defined purely by survival, humans began living lives defined by contribution. The question was no longer just, how do we endure, but what can I bring to the community? That question opened the door to forms of creativity that had never before been possible. Art, once limited to cave walls and small symbolic objects, began to appear more frequently in everyday life. Tools were decorated with motifs that carried cultural significance. Clothing featured patterns unique to particular groups. Ritual objects became more elaborate, carved with careful attention and infused with meaning that only initiates might fully understand. These expressions weren't luxuries. They were embodiments of identity. They allowed humans to articulate who they were, where they came from, and what they believed. At a time when language itself was still evolving in its capacity to express emotion and abstract thought. As culture grew richer, the imagination expanded. Humans began conceptualizing time in deeper, more structured ways. They recognized cycles not just in seasons, but in animal migrations, river levels, and the growth patterns of plants. The earliest calendars were born from careful observation, but they required something beyond observation: the ability to link present experience with future expectation. This was anticipatory cognition, the mental leap that allowed humans to plan years ahead, not just days or months. A group living near a river might remember a time when the waters rose so high they washed away part of their camp. That memory would be passed down as a warning. an instruction to build shelters further from the bank. A sudden shortage of prey might teach hunters to scout new areas long before scarcity threatened the group. These patterns created a new kind of cultural inheritance, one that bound communities not just by shared space, but by shared memory of events they hadn't personally experienced. And with this inheritance came power, the ability to shape the future rather than simply react to it. That power grew even stronger as humans forged connections beyond their immediate groups. Trade networks expanded into sprawling webs that stretched across continents. A group living along the coast might exchange shells for tools crafted by a group living deep in the interior. Another group, skilled in working bone, might trade needles in return for pigments gathered in distant valleys. These exchanges weren't mere transactions. They were opportunities to learn. A traveler carrying a rare object also carried stories of where they came from, details of landscapes, dangers, and opportunities far beyond the horizon. Knowledge became a form of currency, and those who possessed or shared it gained influence. This period gave rise to the earliest forms of what could be called diplomacy. Groups that previously competed for resources began forming alliances, negotiating access to territories, and establishing shared rituals that reinforced bonds between them. These alliances reduced conflict and increased the exchange of ideas. They also strengthened the collective identity of human societies, creating larger cultural units that transcended individual family lines or clans. As societies grew more interconnected, their symbolic worlds expanded. Mythologies blossomed, weaving together stories of creation, death, seasons, animals, spirits, ancestors, and the unseen forces of nature. These myths served multiple functions. They explained phenomena that humans could observe, but not yet scientifically interpret. They encoded moral lessons, social rules, and survival strategies. They provided emotional frameworks for processing loss, celebrating birth, and navigating conflict. And they gave people a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, something eternal. One of the most powerful legacies of this era is the emergence of ritual. Rituals were more than symbolic performances. They were communal experiences that reinforced cohesion. A hunt might begin with a ritual invocation. The arrival of a new season might be marked by a dance. The death of a loved one might be honored with specific gestures, chants, or symbolic objects buried beside the body. These rituals deepened the psychological fabric of communities. They created emotional continuity, binding generations together through shared practices that transcended individual lives. This continuity contributed to a shift in human consciousness. People began to understand themselves not just as isolated beings, but as part of a lineage, a chain of ancestors and descendants connected through time. This awareness of generational continuity laid the groundwork for social structures that extended beyond immediate family ties. It allowed for the emergence of elders whose authority rested not on physical strength, but on memory and wisdom. It also enabled the development of leadership roles shaped by negotiation, storytelling, or spiritual insight rather than brute force. What makes this era extraordinary is how seamlessly these new mental structures fit into the unchanged physical form of humanity. The human body during this period remained almost identical to the bodies of the survivors who had passed through the bottleneck. The skeletons unearthed from these early settlement sites show no dramatic shifts in anatomy. Height, limb proportions, skull shape, all remained within the same narrow range that defines modern humans. But the minds inside those bodies were becoming capable of orchestrating social, cultural, and technological innovations at a scale evolution could never match. This divergence between body and mind created the conditions for a phenomenon that would echo throughout human history: the ability to reshape the environment rather than be shaped by it. You can see its earliest traces in settlement patterns. A group settling near a river might build embankments to protect their seasonal camp. A group living in a windy region might construct shelters partially underground to escape the relentless gusts. A group in a forested area might clear a space large enough to support repeated return visits, subtly transforming the ecosystem in the process. Such interventions were small compared to what would come in later millennia, but they represented a profound shift in mindset. Humans were beginning to view the land not as something fixed and immutable, but as something they could influence. This perception changed the dynamic between humanity and nature. Whereas other animals adapted to local conditions through biological evolution, humans adapted through environmental manipulation. This was not agriculture, not yet, but it laid the psychological foundation for it. The strengthening of social structures also influenced the transmission of knowledge. Teaching became more formalized. Instead of learning purely through observation, children were guided deliberately by mentors or elders who specialized in certain skills. The earliest forms of apprenticeship emerged. A young person might spend years learning to craft blades from a master toolmaker or mastering the spiritual rituals from a community's shaman. These arrangements accelerated the spread of expertise and ensured that valuable skills did not vanish with the death of an individual. This period also saw innovations in tracking, navigation, and resource management. Humans learned to interpret the environment with astonishing precision. A broken twig could reveal the direction of an animal. The sound of distant birds could indicate the presence of water. The color of soil could hint at edible plants or dangerous terrain. This heightened environmental literacy was not genetic, it was cultural. And it was passed on through stories, demonstrations, and rituals that wove survival knowledge into the fabric of everyday life. As knowledge accumulated, new forms of technology emerged. The invention of microlithic tools, small, sharp stone blades that could be combined into composite tools, represented a leap in efficiency and versatility. These tools could be attached to handles, shafts, or bone supports, allowing humans to create saws, sickles, spears, and knives with unprecedented precision. This was not yet the industrial creativity of later eras, but it was a glimpse of the ingenuity that lay ahead. Human societies during this era also began structuring themselves spatially. Camps were organized deliberately, with specific areas for tool-making, cooking, sleeping, or ritual gatherings. The layout of these camps reveals a growing awareness of order. Spaces were no longer just functional, they were meaningful. The fire at the center of the camp became a focal point of identity. The areas where elders told stories became places of learning. The spots where rituals took place became sacred. This spatial organization foreshadowed the architecture of future settlements, villages, towns, and eventually cities. It also reflects a deepening sense of community identity. People belonged not just to a group, but to a place. That place carried emotional weight, history, and continuity, even if the group moved between seasonal sites. Land was no longer just terrain, it was memory. Perhaps the most profound consequence of this era was the emergence of intergenerational time. Humans began thinking not just in terms of the immediate future, but in terms of the futures of their children and grandchildren. They made decisions based on long-term consequences, prioritizing sustainability over immediate gain. This shift required abstract reasoning at a level no other species had ever achieved. It also demanded a sense of responsibility, an awareness that choices made now would ripple into the future. This sense of responsibility crystallized in the form of early spiritual systems. Whether expressed through ancestor worship, nature spirits, or cosmic forces, these systems encouraged people to consider the consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for the entire community, and even the land itself. These beliefs reinforced ethical frameworks that guided behavior, promoting cooperation, empathy, and restraint. They also allowed people to confront existential questions, life, death, purpose, in ways that provided emotional stability. Throughout all these developments, the body remained a quiet constant. It did not adapt with new muscles or bones or organs. Instead, it served as a vessel for a mind that was racing far ahead of its evolutionary roots. This static form, combined with a dynamic mind, created a tension that would eventually reshape the world in ways no human of this era could have imagined. Humanity's growing cultural complexity set the stage for a leap that would transform everything. The transition from foraging to farming, from wandering to settling permanently, from storytelling to record-keeping. But before those changes came, there was this long formative period when humans learned who they were, creatures defined not by anatomy but by imagination, not by instinct but by ingenuity, not by evolution but by culture. This era is the heartbeat beneath civilization, the moment when humans stopped merely surviving and began becoming something else, something capable of shaping worlds, preserving knowledge, and constructing meaning that outlasted individual lives. It is here, in these quiet centuries of settlement and exchange, that humanity first glimpsed its own potential to become the makers of history rather than its subjects. From this foundation would rise everything: agriculture, architecture, trade, belief systems, and eventually the civilizations that would carve their marks into stone and memory alike. But the body remained unchanged through it all, a silent witness to the mind's unfolding power. The blueprint that emerged from the volcanic winter endured, even as the patterns of human thought expanded into realms that evolution had never prepared the body to navigate. This is the paradox at the core of humanity's journey. We became creatures of infinite possibility, housed in bodies shaped for a world long vanished. And in the millennia that followed, that tension would guide us into triumphs, catastrophes, and transformations far greater than any our ancestors could have dreamed as they gathered around fires beneath ancient skies. By the time the first faint outlines of agriculture began to flicker across the human imagination, the world had already been reshaped, not by storms or ice or tectonic upheavals, but by people themselves. For tens of thousands of years, humanity had mastered the art of living with the land without being bound to it. They moved through forests, deserts, and mountains like migrating constellations, their identities rooted not in structures, but in stories, rituals, and shared memory. Yet the same psychological forces that allowed humans to survive catastrophe, imagination, cooperation, and the ability to extract meaning from the world, were slowly pushing them toward a new threshold, one that would change their relationship with the earth forever. Part 6 is the story of how the human mind, once sharpened by calamity and refined through scarcity, stepped into a role evolution had never intended: the creator of permanence. Long before farms or cities existed, humans were already manipulating their environment in subtle but intentional ways. A group returning seasonally to a familiar valley might burn brush to encourage the growth of specific plants. They might create pathways that funneled animals toward predictable traps. They might store certain foods in secure hiding places, making it easier to survive lean seasons. These practices weren't yet agriculture, but they were early whispers of cultivation, small acts of stewardship that nudged the land toward human needs. The land responded, becoming more predictable, more generous, more shaped by human intention. In these environments, something profound happened. People began to see patterns they had not noticed before. A seed dropped near camp sprouted the following year. A patch of edible plants grew more densely because it had been cleared of competing shrubs. Certain animals returned to the same grazing grounds year after year because the land had been subtly engineered to draw them in. These observations were not accidents. They were the building blocks of an emerging system of thought, one that recognized the possibility of long-term causation. Humans began to understand that today's actions could shape tomorrow's abundance. This insight was revolutionary. For the first time, humans were not just reacting to their environment, they were experimenting with it. They began, consciously or unconsciously, to perform the world's earliest agricultural experiments. A child might scatter seeds where a plant had grown well the season before. Hunters might leave behind the bones of a successful hunt, fertilizing the soil with nutrients that enriched future growth. These behaviors accumulated like sediment, each layer contributing to a slow but unstoppable shift. But before agriculture could take root, something else had to happen. Humans needed to develop a relationship with the land strong enough to compete with the ancient call of mobility. For countless generations, movement had been freedom. It allowed groups to follow resources, avoid conflict, and escape environmental instability. Yet as social structures deepened and symbolic cultures flourished, attachment to place grew stronger. Seasonal camps became intergenerational memory sites. Rivers, cliffs, and groves became embedded in stories and rituals. The land itself became part of identity. This spiritual and emotional relationship with place laid the psychological groundwork for settlement. A group that believed a valley was home to the spirits of ancestors would be more reluctant to abandon it. A group that buried generations of elders beneath a cluster of trees would feel tied to that grove in ways no purely practical considerations could sever. These emotional anchors began to compete with the practical advantages of mobility. Meanwhile, climate patterns were shifting. As the world warmed further after the glacial periods, certain regions became especially fertile. Rainfall patterns stabilized. Rivers carved reliable channels. Wild grains grew abundantly in belts that stretched across what would later be called the Fertile Crescent, parts of Africa, East Asia, and the Americas. These regions offered something humanity had not encountered for millennia: predictable abundance. Predictability breeds opportunity. With reliable food sources, humans could afford to stay longer in one place, and with extended stays came experimentation. People spent more time observing plants, collecting seeds, tracking which patches flourished and which faltered. Slowly, through trial and error that spanned generations, humans began selecting the wild plants that produced the largest seeds, the sweetest fruits, the most reliable harvests. None of this required deliberate planning. It was an emergent process, a collaboration between human preference and natural variation. But as impactful as this beginning was, agriculture did not arise because humans suddenly became better at growing food. It arose because humans first transformed their minds in ways that made agriculture imaginable. They had learned to plan far into the future, to cooperate on increasingly complex tasks, to transmit specialized knowledge across generations, and to embed meaning into places and practices. The ground was fertile, not just in the physical sense, but in the cognitive one. Consider the mental leap required to plant something today for a meal months away. This is not instinctive behavior. It requires an understanding of cause and effect extended across time. It requires foresight, patience, and trust in a process that offers no immediate reward. This mindset did not come from genetic evolution. It came from cultural evolution. Thousands of years of practicing delayed gratification, long-term planning, and collective memory. As humans grew more attached to specific places, they began to perceive the land not as a transient resource, but as a partner. They observed its moods, its rhythms, its offerings. They crafted rituals to call for rain or to give thanks for abundance. These rituals weren't just expressions of belief. They were cognitive tools that reinforced cooperation. A group that gathered yearly to celebrate the harvest was a group that shared responsibilities, shared memories, and shared futures. Still, the transition from foraging to farming was neither quick nor complete. For thousands of years, humans lived in hybrid systems, blending mobility with early cultivation practices. They planted seeds in seasonal camps and returned months later to gather the results. They managed herds of semi-wild animals, guiding their movements without fully domesticating them. They shaped landscapes without yet settling permanently. These transitional societies were remarkably complex, balancing the freedom of movement with the security of emerging agriculture. During this period, innovation exploded. The earliest storage techniques emerged: pits lined with clay, woven baskets sealed with pitch, animal skins hung from tree branches. Storage fundamentally altered the human relationship with time. Food no longer disappeared between seasons. It could be saved, protected, accumulated, and once accumulation became possible, social dynamics shifted. Groups with more storage capacity could survive harsh seasons. Those with less struggled. Wealth, if it could be called that, began to take its first symbolic form. This early proto-wealth wasn't just food. It was knowledge. Groups that mastered seed harvesting and planting prospered. Groups that perfected hunting strategies or perfected ritual systems that kept social order stable grew more cohesive. Knowledge became a form of power, silent, invisible, and far more valuable than physical strength. As the concept of wealth grew, so did the concept of responsibility. Elders became custodians of knowledge essential for survival. Spiritual leaders became guardians of rituals that bound communities together. Toolmakers, healers, and trackers all carried specialized roles, each contributing to the growing tapestry of early society. For the first time, individuals might be valued not for what they could physically do, but for what they knew. Yet through all this complexity, the human body remained unchanged. The bones of these early semi-sedentary people are indistinguishable from those of their ancestors who roamed the plains. The same skeletal proportions, the same brain case dimensions, the same physical capacities. If anything did change, it was cultural rather than biological. New stress marks on bones from grinding grain, new wear patterns on teeth from starch-rich diets. These were not evolutionary adaptations, but lifestyle imprints. The species remained physically frozen even as its behaviors evolved at lightning speed. Eventually, in several regions across the world, and almost certainly independently, humans crossed a threshold so profound it reshaped the trajectory of the entire species, full domestication of plants and animals. This leap did not happen overnight. It was the product of countless generations observing, selecting, planting, and tending. But once the leap was made, its consequences were irreversible. With farming came permanent settlement. A group that planted fields needed to defend them. A community that domesticated animals needed to protect its herds. The first fences appeared, not to keep humans in, but to keep predators out. These fenced areas represented a new kind of relationship between people and place, one defined by ownership and stewardship. A field wasn't just a source of food. It was a symbol of investment, a physical embodiment of a family's labor and future. Settlements grew larger, structures became more solid, constructed from mud, wood, and stone. Food surpluses allowed populations to grow. With more people came more roles. Some individuals became full-time artisans, others became spiritual leaders, others specialized in conflict resolution or community coordination. Social hierarchies emerged, not necessarily rigid, but increasingly structured. A settlement was no longer a cluster of shelters. It was an organism, a network of interdependent roles. This transformation demanded a revolution in communication. Oral traditions weren't enough to manage the complexities of growing societies. Humans developed new forms of symbolic representation. Early counting systems, tallies carved into bone or wood, marks indicating ownership or contribution. These systems paved the way for writing, but long before writing existed, humans were already using symbols to administer the distribution of resources, coordinate labor, and track lineage. The shift toward farming also reshaped the spiritual world. As people became more dependent on the land, their belief systems increasingly revolved around cycles of growth and decay. Fertility rituals emerged, honoring the forces thought to control the success of crops. Ancestor worship deepened, with the dead perceived as guardians of the land they once walked. The duality of death and growth became central to spiritual thought. These early belief systems laid the foundation for the agricultural religions that would later dominate human civilization. Agriculture brought many benefits, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Sedentary life meant disease could spread more easily. Population growth meant competition for resources intensified. Dependence on crops made communities vulnerable to drought, pests, or flooding. These pressures drove further innovation. Irrigation systems emerged. Granaries were built. Communal decision-making structures evolved to address conflicts. It was in this crucible of complexity that humanity's most powerful inventions began to take shape. But one thing did not change: the human body. Through all the innovation, all the settlement, all the cultural evolution, our physical form remained anchored to its ancient blueprint. This paradox became even more striking as societies expanded. People living in walled settlements, practicing specialized labor, engaged in complex rituals, and accumulating wealth had bodies nearly identical to their nomadic ancestors, who had hunted mammoths or crossed deserts on foot. The machinery of the mind had outpaced the machinery of the body by orders of magnitude. This divergence set humanity on a trajectory toward a future in which biological evolution would become increasingly irrelevant. Instead of adapting through genes, humans adapted through culture, technology, social organization, and imagination. A society that faced a challenge didn't wait for evolution to solve it. It invented solutions. Tools grew more complex. Settlements grew larger. Belief systems grew more elaborate. And all the while, the human skeleton remained the same silent witness to a revolution happening entirely in the realm of the mind. In this era, the seeds of civilization were planted, not in the soil, but in consciousness. Humans had learned not just to survive, but to shape, predict, preserve, accumulate, and create. They had learned to live not just for themselves, but for generations yet unborn. The volcanic winter had nearly extinguished the species, but in surviving it, humanity gained something no mutation could have produced: the ability to transcend the limits of biology. From this point forward, every leap humanity would make, writing, cities, empires, science, would be built not on evolution, but on innovation. And the body, that ancient frame forged in the deep past, would follow along unchanged, carrying a mind increasingly capable of reshaping the world, for better or worse. By the time the first true villages began forming across the scattered regions where agriculture had taken root, humanity stood at the edge of a transformation so immense it would redefine not only how people lived, but how they understood themselves. The shift from mobile bands to settled communities was not simply a matter of building houses and tending crops. It was a psychological revolution. It demanded new ways of thinking about time, responsibility, identity, and power. It transformed the human mind from something shaped by survival into something capable of constructing entire worlds of meaning that would outlive the people who imagined them. And at the heart of this transformation lay one persistent truth. The human body, unchanged through all of it, now carried a mind increasingly capable of outgrowing the constraints of nature itself. Imagine one of the earliest sedentary settlements, perched along the fertile banks of a river whose annual floods bring both abundance and danger. The morning sun glints off wet earth, and the shouts of farmers echo across fields dotted with young shoots. Huts made from mud, reeds, and timber circle a central communal space where elders gather to settle disputes or bless important events. Children play in the dust, chasing one another between structures that their grandparents helped build. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires, carrying the scent of grain porridge and roasted fish. This is no longer a nomadic camp waiting for the seasons to change. This is home. What makes such a place extraordinary is not its architecture or its crops, but the mental landscape it requires. Settled life demands anticipation, coordination, and foresight at a scale no foraging society ever needed. A field left untended can rot. Irrigation channels neglected for a single season can collapse. Grain stores mismanaged can doom an entire community. The future becomes a real and pressing concern, not an abstract philosophical idea. People begin to measure time in cycles, planting, tending, harvesting, rather than in migrations or hunts. The past becomes something written into the land, marked by the echoes of previous seasons. This new relationship with time reshapes the imagination. People begin to think not just of what the world is, but what it might become. They imagine better harvests, stronger homes, safer boundaries. They imagine conflicts and prepare for them. They imagine prosperity and strategize how to achieve it. These visions require systems, rules, roles, and hierarchies that help coordinate communal effort. In this way, sedentary life becomes the crucible of early governance. Leadership, once informal and based on experience, takes on clearer forms. Some communities appoint elders to distribute resources. Others rely on spiritual leaders whose perceived connection to unseen forces gives them authority. Still others elevate skilled organizers who manage labor during crucial agricultural periods. These roles, once temporary or situational, begin to solidify. Authority becomes a structure rather than a moment. And with structure comes inequality. Inequality is not born of malice. It arises from necessity. A community that grows enough food to feed more than its members must decide how to store it, who protects it, and who distributes it. Those entrusted with these tasks become gatekeepers of survival. A person who controls a granary controls life itself. Over time, control over resources becomes power, subtle at first, but unmistakable. This early stratification sets the stage for social classes: farmers who till the land, artisans who produce tools and ornaments, spiritual leaders who guide rituals, administrators who coordinate labor, warriors who defend boundaries. Each role carries different responsibilities and benefits. These differences begin to shape identity. People no longer see themselves merely as members of a group, but as parts of a social structure with defined expectations. As society becomes more layered, communication evolves. Oral tradition remains vital, but it must now support far more information. Who owns which field? How many people contributed to digging a canal? How much grain must be set aside for lean years? Oral memory alone struggles to hold these growing complexities. Into this gap steps symbolism: marks on clay, scratched lines on bone, tokens representing quantities or obligations. These early symbolic systems are not yet writing, but they are its ancestors. They embody the idea that information can exist outside the human mind. The appearance of such symbols marks a profound cognitive leap. Until this moment, knowledge existed only in memory, vulnerable to death or forgetfulness. But when symbols capture knowledge, information gains permanence. A person can carry their understanding in their hands. A community can preserve its history in physical objects. A leader can impose order through marks that represent agreements or boundaries. The world becomes legible in new ways. This legibility, however, introduces new challenges. When knowledge becomes externalized, questions of ownership arise. Who controls the symbols? Who decides what they mean? The person who can record transactions or interpret signs gains influence. Literacy, though primitive, becomes power. This dynamic foreshadows the future rise of scribes, bureaucrats, and historians whose abilities will shape entire civilizations. But while these early societies grew more complex, the body remained unchanged. The same skeleton that once carried hunters across savannas now carried farmers who bent over fields for hours at a time. The physical demands changed, but the body did not evolve to meet them. Instead, culture adapted. New tools emerged: hoes, plows, baskets, sickles, to compensate for physical limitations. Clothes evolved to protect workers from sun and thorns. Infrastructure, granaries, walls, canals, shifted some burdens from muscle to architecture. The environment was changing, but evolution was silent. This silence created deeper consequences. The human body, optimized for mobility and varied activity, now faced repetitive motions and sedentary habits. Bones once shaped by running and climbing now bore the strain of constant crouching and lifting. Teeth once used for tearing meat now ground down grains that eroded enamel. Disease spread more easily in dense settlements. Childhood mortality rose. Paradoxically, health declined even as population grew. Yet culture kept pushing forward, compensating for every flaw evolution failed to correct. As communities expanded, so did the imagination. People began to envision not just villages, but landscapes under their stewardship. Irrigation systems snaked across fields. Canal networks redirected rivers. Terraces carved into hillsides transformed difficult terrain into fertile land. These feats required cooperation on a scale unmatched in human history. Carving a canal takes dozens of hands. Building a terrace takes years of coordinated labor. These projects became social factories, producing unity as much as they produced food. Large-scale cooperation altered social psychology. People learned to trust systems, not just individuals. They obeyed leaders because the systems demanded it. They accepted rules because breaking them risked collapse. Order became as valuable as water. And into this order flowed ritual. Rituals in early agricultural societies served multiple functions. They coordinated planting and harvest schedules. They established moral norms. They strengthened group identity. They soothed anxieties in the face of droughts or floods. Most importantly, they sanctified the land. A community that believed its fields were blessed worked harder and more cohesively. Rituals transformed agriculture from a technical task into a sacred duty. This spiritualization of the land reshaped belief systems. Gods of fertility, rain, sun, and earth emerged. Ancestors became guardians of crops. The rhythm of seasons became a cosmic narrative. Humans began seeing themselves not just as manipulators of the environment, but as participants in a cosmic cycle of growth and decay. This worldview infused meaning into every action, from planting seeds to burying the dead. Burials became more complex during this period. People were interred with objects, tools, ornaments, food, as though preparing them for a journey beyond life. These graves reveal a new dimension of identity. A person was no longer just a body, but a being with continuity beyond death. This notion reinforced long-term thinking. If ancestors watched from beyond, the living owed them reverence. If descendants would one day inherit the land, the living owed them stewardship. Time was no longer a straight line. It was a loop, a cycle binding generations. This cyclical worldview strengthened the continuity of culture. Traditions became obligations. Roles became heritable. Social structures grew more rigid. The fluidity of nomadic life gave way to the solidity of sedentary hierarchy. This rigidity brought stability and tension. As wealth accumulated, it concentrated. A family with more land produced more food. More food meant more offspring, more influence, more control. Inequality deepened, carving visible lines into society. Some groups began fortifying their settlements, not for protection from nature, but from rival humans. Conflict, once rare and small-scale, began to grow. Disputes over territory, water rights, and food stores became sources of violence. Walls, once symbolic, became physical barriers. Yet even in the midst of rising inequality and conflict, cooperation remained humanity's greatest strength. Settlements formed alliances, sharing resources or coordinating defensive strategies. Large gatherings, proto-festivals, bridged rival communities. Trade routes expanded further, exchanging not only goods but ideas. A tool invented in one region might appear thousands of miles away within a generation. A ritual practiced by one tribe might inspire new traditions in another. Culture flowed like a river, wide and unstoppable. One of the most extraordinary outcomes of this era was the invention of specialization beyond survival. Artists, storytellers, and musicians emerged whose contributions did not directly feed or defend the community, but enriched its inner world. Artisans carved intricate designs into pottery. Storytellers memorized lineages, stretching back generations. Musicians created rhythms that synchronized emotional states during communal gatherings. These cultural specialists elevated community identity into something transcendent. They turned settlements into societies. The growing complexity of society required new forms of cognition. People needed to remember debts, land boundaries, resource allocations, and ritual sequences. These demands stretched the limits of memory, driving the development of mnemonic systems, songs, patterns, rhythms, and symbolic objects designed to store information in easily retrievable ways. These systems foreshadowed the emergence of writing. But even before writing existed, they represented a major upgrade in humanity's capacity to manage complexity. This complexity carried consequences. The more structured societies became, the more dependent they were on order. A drought could destabilize a settlement. A leader's death could trigger succession disputes. A failed harvest could lead to famine. Yet in each case, culture, not biology, provided the tools to navigate crisis. Communities developed contingency plans, storage strategies, and conflict resolution rituals. These cultural adaptations protected societies from collapse far more effectively than any mutation could have. What makes this period so remarkable is how humans balanced continuity with change. They retained the same bodies, the same skeletal architecture, the same brain size. Yet their minds became repositories of expanding worlds, spiritual, symbolic, intellectual. They built societies on ideas that had no physical form, but enormous psychological power. And through this balance, they laid the foundation for civilization. Agriculture did not make humans superior. It made humans responsible. It forced them to navigate consequences that extended beyond their lifetimes. It demanded cooperation, memory, and imagination. It required systems that could manage increasing complexity. And it exposed humanity's greatest paradox. Our bodies remain relics of the past even as our minds sprint into the future. By the end of this era, humanity had become something evolution never anticipated, a species whose survival depended not on physical adaptation, but on its ability to create, preserve, and transmit culture across generations. Every field planted, every ritual performed, every story told was part of an inheritance that grew richer with time. From these early villages would rise cities, kingdoms, empires, and civilizations. But the body carrying this monumental ambition remained unchanged, a biological time capsule preserving the ancient form of a species that had long since left the natural world behind and stepped into one of its own making. Humanity had become an architect of its own destiny. But in shaping the land and the structures of society, it had unknowingly stepped into a new cycle, a cycle that would one day confront it with challenges far different from those of the past. The world was no longer the unpredictable force that shaped humanity. Humanity had become the unpredictable force shaping the world. By the time the earliest cities began pressing themselves into the landscape, humanity had already crossed multiple thresholds: ecological, psychological, and cultural. But what unfolded in the age of rising settlements was something far more profound than the construction of walls or the accumulation of grain. It was the birth of a new world, one that no creature on earth had ever inhabited before, a world built not from instinct or evolution, but from imagination and organization. Cities were not just clusters of buildings. They were living systems, artificial ecosystems held together by trust, memory, language, and a willingness to cooperate in numbers far beyond anything the human mind had been designed for. And yet, through all this, the human body remained unchanged, a quiet relic of an ancient past marching steadily into a future it had not evolved to face. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, imagine standing at the edge of one of the earliest proto-cities, long before names like Jericho or Çatalhöyük were etched into clay tablets. The sun rises over a cluster of structures built from mud brick, timber, and stone. Smoke curls upward from communal hearths. People shuffle between dwellings, carrying baskets of grain, tools, or clay jars. Livestock bleat from enclosures. Children dart through narrow alleyways, chasing each other around stacks of pottery. It feels alive, not like a camp or a village, but like something emergent, something greater than the sum of its parts. A place that hums with the collective energy of hundreds of people synchronized in purpose. What makes a city fundamentally different from a village isn't its size, it's the cognitive load it demands. A community of a few dozen can run on memory alone. Who hunted with whom, who wronged whom, which family tends which patch of land. But a city requires abstraction. It requires systems that exist outside of any individual's mind, rules encoded in symbols, norms enforced by agreed-upon authority, shared understandings that transcend personal relationships. It requires people to trust complete strangers, to coordinate with individuals they will never meet, to believe in ideas that have no physical form. These mental leaps are astonishingly complex, yet they unfolded without a single change to the human body. The earliest cities forced humans to become something they had never been before, managers of complexity. Grain supplies had to be measured and stored. Irrigation channels needed maintenance. Disputes required impartial resolution. Labor had to be organized for communal projects, walls, canals, temples. The human mind, shaped over millennia to track small group interactions, was now juggling problems on a scale that would have overwhelmed earlier generations. But culture, once again, stepped in where biology could not. Humans developed roles: governors, priests, traders, builders, that distributed cognitive load across the community. This division of labor allowed the city to function like a vast collaborative brain. Such collaboration required communication. Oral tradition was no longer enough. As cities grew, so did the volume of information they needed to store. Harvest yields, trade agreements, population counts, temple offerings. Symbols scratched into clay became proto-writing. Tokens and tallies evolved into standardized systems of record. Eventually, these symbols began representing not just quantities, but concepts. Writing was born, not from a desire to create literature, but from the urgent need to manage complexity. It was a practical tool long before it was a poetic one. The invention of writing marks one of the most significant cognitive revolutions in human history. It externalized thought in ways far beyond the markings of earlier cultures. A written record preserved agreements long after memory faded. It allowed leaders to coordinate across distance. It enabled knowledge to survive beyond the lifespan of any individual. Writing transformed time, allowing the present to communicate with the future. It transformed space, allowing ideas to move faster than footsteps. And it transformed society, enabling layers of administration and governance that had once been impossible. Yet even as writing expanded the reach of the mind, it also deepened inequality. The ability to interpret symbols became a form of power. Scribes, priests, and administrators gained influence because they commanded the tools that made civilization function. Knowledge stratified society in ways biology never had. With stratification came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came political power. Political power took many forms. In some cities, elders governed through consensus. In others, spiritual leaders guided decisions based on rituals and omens. In still others, charismatic individuals seized authority, combining military strength with symbolic legitimacy. These leaders often justified their rule through cosmology, claiming descent from gods, authority from ancestors, or guardianship over the land. These narratives were not manipulations, but psychological technologies that bound communities to a common vision. Belief systems became the backbone of early governance, giving structure and meaning to the social order. As cities grew, their needs expanded. Defense became essential. Walls were built, first as simple enclosures, then as complex fortifications. The construction of walls was not just an architectural feat. It was a declaration of identity. A city with walls saw itself as distinct from the world beyond. The walls protected people not only from external threats, but from the psychological fear of disorder. Inside the walls lay predictability, safety, structure. Outside lay uncertainty. This fear of the outside world wasn't paranoia. It was rational. The rise of agriculture and cities intensified competition for resources. Settlements fought over fertile land, water sources, mineral deposits, and trade routes. Organized conflict emerged. Battles, raids, sieges. Warfare, once a chaotic struggle between small groups, became systematic. Weapons evolved. Defensive strategies matured. Leaders emerged who specialized in war. This was not a deviation from human nature, but an outcome of increasing complexity. Conflict is a natural expression of competition at scale. But even as cities learned to defend themselves, they also learned to connect with one another. Trade routes stretched across continents, linking communities through networks of exchange. Goods traveled astonishing distances, obsidian from volcanic regions, shells from coastlines, salt from deserts, wool from mountain herders. But what moved along these routes wasn't just material, it was culture. Ideas spread as quickly as goods. Innovations in metallurgy, weaving, pottery, and architecture traveled across regions. Religious concepts migrated from one city to another, blending into hybrid systems of belief. Artistic styles evolved through contact and imitation. A potter in one city might adopt a technique developed hundreds of miles away. A ritual from one valley might inspire new practices in distant mountains. These cultural exchanges were the arteries through which humanity's shared identity began to circulate. This interconnectedness accelerated innovation. Metallurgy emerged from such exchanges. The ability to shape copper, then bronze, then iron revolutionized tool-making and warfare alike. But metallurgy wasn't just a technical breakthrough, it was symbolic. The transformation of raw ore into gleaming metal became a metaphor for transformation itself. Metalworkers were seen not merely as artisans, but as magicians, alchemists, custodians of sacred fire. Their craft blended science and spirituality in equal measure. As metal tools improved, agriculture became more efficient, fields expanded, irrigation networks grew, populations soared, cities evolved into city-states, and city-states grew into early kingdoms. Social hierarchies hardened, becoming more formalized. Rulers erected monumental structures, temples, palaces, shrines, not only to demonstrate power, but to embody the city's identity. Stone and brick became repositories of memory, holding stories in their architecture long before those stories were written down. These monuments served another purpose. They created a shared sense of awe. When a community gathered before a towering ziggurat or temple, the architecture itself reinforced belief in the authority that built it. The scale of these structures exceeded the capacity of any individual, reminding people that the power of the group, organized, cooperative, unified, could accomplish the impossible. This sense of collective power deepened trust in the systems that governed them. But while cities grew outward in structures and upward in complexity, they grew inward in diversity. Urban centers attracted specialists, merchants, artisans, scholars, musicians, healers. The mixing of cultures within these spaces created vibrant ecosystems of innovation. A potter might learn new firing techniques from a trader visiting from another region. A healer might adopt herbs or remedies brought from distant lands. A storyteller might weave foreign myths into local traditions. Cities became crucibles of cultural fusion. Yet for all this social and intellectual flourishing, the human body remained the same. It walked the same way, it breathed the same way. Its bones were indistinguishable from those of its ancestors. It was not evolving to meet the demands of urban life. Instead, technology and culture were evolving around it, compensating for every limitation. This mismatch grew more pronounced as cities expanded. The human mind was becoming increasingly adept at navigating symbolic systems, laws, taxes, rituals, markets, while the human body struggled with the pressures of crowded living, disease, and labor intensification. Disease, in particular, became a defining feature of urban life. Settlements with dense populations created perfect conditions for pathogens to spread. Sickness swept through early cities with devastating speed. Plagues humbled societies that believed themselves invincible. Yet even these catastrophes became catalysts for innovation. Communities developed sanitation practices, healing rituals, and early forms of public health. They learned to quarantine, to cleanse, to build infrastructure that protected the collective. Disease, like every other challenge, was met not with biological adaptation, but with cultural ingenuity. The spiritual world evolved alongside the material one. As societies grew larger and more complex, their belief systems expanded to meet new psychological needs. Early deities tied to the land, spirits of rivers, animals, and ancestors, gave way to gods associated with law, justice, craft, war, and kingship. The pantheon became a reflection of society's structure, a cosmic mirror that encoded social order into myth. Temples became centers of both worship and administration. Priests became not only spiritual guides, but managers of information, wealth, and labor. In this era, humanity began confronting existential questions with unprecedented depth. Where do we come from? What is the purpose of suffering? What happens after death? These questions had begun forming in earlier eras, but now they took on philosophical richness. Writing allowed for the preservation of myths, laws, and reflections. Stories became canonized, laws became codified, ethics became formalized. The human mind had not changed biologically, but its conceptual world had expanded infinitely. Every advancement, cities, writing, metalworking, religion, governance, was built on a mental revolution that had begun tens of thousands of years earlier when humans learned to imagine beyond instinct. And yet, through all this transformation, the human body remained locked in its ancient form. The skeleton that once fled predators and stalked gazelles now climbed temple stairs and carried clay tablets. The hands that once shaped flint blades now etched marks into wet clay. The eyes that once scanned horizons for danger now studied symbols tracking the movement of stars. The world humans created was growing far more complex than the world they had evolved for. But this mismatch did not hinder them. It empowered them. Because culture, not biology, was now the engine of adaptation. And with every generation, the mind expanded further, leaving the body behind. By the end of this era, humanity had become something evolutionary theory alone could not explain. A species whose destiny was determined not by physical traits, but by imagination, cooperation, and symbolic thought. Cities were no longer experiments. They were the foundation of civilization. Writing was no longer a convenience. It was the architecture of memory. Religion was no longer a belief. It was a system of meaning. And power was no longer personal. It was institutional. From this point forward, the story of humanity would no longer be the story of adaptation to nature. It would be the story of how humans re-engineered nature, and eventually themselves. But beneath the stone walls, beneath the clay tablets, beneath the rituals and markets and palaces, one truth remained unchanged. The ancient body still carried the future. A body forged in the crucible of fire and ice, now walked confidently through the avenues of cities it was never designed to build, shaped not by evolution, but by the unstoppable force of the human mind. By the time humanity entered the age of bronze and early empires, the world had already become a vast tapestry of interconnected cities, trade networks, and belief systems. But the true transformation unfolding beneath it all was not architectural or political. It was psychological. It was the deep rewiring of the human mind, the slow, deliberate construction of a mental universe that no longer depended on direct experience or immediate surroundings. Instead, humanity was learning to navigate abstractions, law, myth, time, authority, destiny, Ideas became as real as stone. Stories became as powerful as armies. And for the first time, humans began to grapple with forces they themselves had created, forces that would one day shape the entire arc of civilization. Through it all, the human body remained unchanged, still carrying the ancient blueprint inherited from ancestors who had wandered the plains long before writing, cities, or kingdoms existed. Imagine the early Bronze Age city-states spread across river valleys and fertile plains. The dawn breaks over temples, workshops, markets, and administrative centers that it took generations to build. Streets fill with the noise of trade, the clang of metalworkers shaping copper into blades, the calls of merchants advertising dyed cloth, grain, wine, salt, spices. Messengers carrying clay tablets jog between districts, delivering orders and recording inventories. On the city's highest platform, priests offer incense to unseen forces that the people believe govern everything from rainfall to political stability. Below, laborers and artisans file to their daily tasks, contributing to a vast interdependent organism that has taken shape around them. What distinguishes these societies from the villages that came before is not merely scale, but abstraction. Life in a city requires people to trust systems they cannot see, systems of taxation, justice, administration, and belief. A farmer must trust that the grain he contributes to communal storage will be redistributed fairly. A merchant must trust that weights and measures are standardized. A laborer must trust that the calendar used to time planting rituals is accurate. These layers of trust are invisible, yet they hold the society together more tightly than any stone wall. And this trust is reinforced by writing. Writing takes the ephemeral, promises, commands, agreements, and fixes them in physical form. A clay tablet does not forget. A carved inscription does not shift its meaning with time. Writing creates accountability. It creates permanence. It creates the concept of history. Before writing, history was a fluid, evolving narrative carried in memory. After writing, history became a record with authority, something that could be referred to, interpreted, and eventually contested. But writing does more than record. It transforms the way people think. When thought is externalized, it can be analyzed. It can be revised. It can be transmitted without distortion across generations. Writing allows for the accumulation of knowledge on a scale impossible for oral societies. Techniques for metalworking, medical remedies, astronomical observations, legal codes. These can be refined over centuries, each generation building on the discoveries of the last. Civilization takes on momentum. Progress becomes cumulative. Yet the acceleration of knowledge also introduces a new tension. As information becomes concentrated in the hands of scribes, priests, and administrators, power consolidates. The literate become interpreters of reality. They shape the narratives that guide society. They decide which stories are preserved and which are allowed to fade. In doing so, they begin to shape the consciousness of entire populations. Across the ancient world, monumental architecture becomes a tool for shaping thought as much as for demonstrating wealth. Ziggurats, pyramids, temple complexes. These structures are built on a scale so immense that they alter the skyline and the collective psyche. They tell the people that their leaders are powerful enough to challenge gravity, powerful enough to command thousands of workers for years at a time, powerful enough to connect earth to heaven. These structures fuse political authority with spiritual authority. The leaders who commission them are no longer just rulers. They become intermediaries between the human and the divine. This fusion of religion and politics creates stability, but also vulnerability. If a ruler's legitimacy depends on cosmic approval, then natural disasters, droughts, and military defeats can erode authority. Leaders respond by expanding ritual systems, creating more elaborate ceremonies, invoking more complex mythologies. They construct narratives that frame success as divine favor and failure as divine displeasure, to be remedied through offerings or obedience. These narratives, repeated generation after generation, grow into mythic frameworks that define entire civilizations. Meanwhile, trade routes stretch across continents, carrying not just goods but ideologies. Bronze weapons and tools travel from one civilization to another. So do stories of gods, creation myths, astronomical theories, medical practices, and ethical teachings. Cultures blend, diverge, evolve. A merchant in one city might practice a ritual learned from another. A warrior might carry a weapon forged in a distant land. A priest might incorporate foreign symbols into local mythology. Humanity becomes a network of exchanges, each node influencing the others. But even as ideas expand, the physical body remains the same. The bones unearthed from Bronze Age burials are indistinguishable from those of earlier humans. The same hands that once carved flint tools now shape bronze blades. The same feet that wandered for miles now stand on stone floors, while leaders speak from raised platforms. The same lungs that once breathed the cold air of glacial winds now inhale the smoke of city hearths and temple incense. The body has not kept pace with the demands of civilization, so culture continues to adapt around it. This mismatch becomes most evident in labor. The human body, built for endurance and varied movement, is now subjected to repetitive tasks: working bellows, grinding grain, hauling stone, turning wheels. Joints wear down, teeth erode. Disease spreads through crowded streets. But instead of evolving biological resistance, humans develop social and technological solutions. They appoint healers, they create drainage systems, they invent tools that shift labor from muscle to mechanism. Culture becomes a shield against the consequences of its own innovations. At the same time, cities foster new kinds of identity. People no longer define themselves only by family or tribe, but by profession, district, or allegiance to a king. A metal worker in one city has more in common with a metal worker in another than with a farmer living nearby. Specialization creates horizontal ties across regions, forming early professional networks. A potter's style might influence another potter living hundreds of miles away. A healer might adopt a remedy developed in a distant civilization. Knowledge flows through these networks like blood through veins. Another consequence of specialization is intellectual diversification. In some cities, scholars study the stars, seeking patterns in planetary movements. In others, priests refine cosmologies that attempt to explain creation and fate. In still others, administrators develop mathematical systems to track resources or calculate land boundaries. These intellectual pursuits deepen humanity's engagement with concepts far removed from everyday life. People begin thinking in terms of cycles measured not in seasons, but in centuries. They begin imagining forces that transcend the physical world: destiny, justice, cosmic order. This era also sees the emergence of long-distance trade on an unprecedented scale. Merchants navigate rivers, deserts, and seas, connecting empires that had never before encountered one another. The exchange of goods, tin, copper, spices, textiles, drives innovation in transportation. Boats become more sophisticated. Pack animals become essential. Roads emerge. And with each journey, merchants carry stories, spreading ideas that transform cultures far beyond their origins. These networks create interdependence. A drought in one region can affect trade routes thousands of miles away. A war between two kingdoms can disrupt the flow of goods across continents. Interdependence is both a strength and a vulnerability. It strengthens collective security, shared prosperity, and technological exchange. But it also means that collapse in one region can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Collapse becomes a recurring pattern in human history, not because humans fail biologically, but because complexity creates fragility. When systems become too interconnected, too dependent on stability, they become vulnerable to shocks, droughts, invasions, disease outbreaks, economic disruptions. Each can unravel the fabric of a society, not slowly but suddenly. The Bronze Age sees multiple collapses. Cities are abandoned, trade routes vanish, writing systems disappear, populations scatter. Yet humanity persists, not by evolving biologically, but by reinventing culturally. After each collapse, new societies emerge, drawing on remnants of the old while forging new innovations. The cycle of destruction and renewal becomes a defining feature of the human story. And each cycle leaves behind lessons encoded in myth, law, and memory. One of the most important developments of this era is the emergence of philosophical thought. In some cities, thinkers begin questioning not just how the world works, but why it exists. They ponder ethics, justice, consciousness, and the nature of reality. They challenge traditional beliefs, explore contradictions, seek principles that might govern both human behavior and cosmic forces. Philosophy marks the moment when the human mind becomes aware of itself, when it begins to examine its own processes. This is not a biological evolution. It is a cultural one, a deepening of introspection made possible by writing, leisure, and intellectual networks. At the same time, religion evolves from local traditions into formal institutions. Temples become centers of authority, wealth, and learning. Priests become mediators not only of spiritual truth, but of political power. Gods evolve with societies, shifting from natural forces to moral authorities. Myth becomes theology. Ritual becomes doctrine. Belief becomes law. Through these transformations, the ancient human body, unchanged in structure, carries a mind that now grapples with ethics, justice, metaphysics, and the meaning of existence. The physical form remains rooted in the Pleistocene, while the mind explores realms no animal had ever conceived. This growing gap between mind and body becomes one of the defining paradoxes of humanity. The body still hungers, tires, and ages as it always has. But the mind constructs systems, economic, political, philosophical, that transcend the individual lifespan. A worker may spend his lifetime building a temple that he will never see completed. A scribe may record laws intended for generations yet unborn. A priest may teach doctrines that will shape entire civilizations long after his death. Humanity, for the first time, steps into historical consciousness, a sense of time that extends beyond personal experience into the distant past and future. This consciousness drives societies to preserve their achievements, commemorate their leaders, and document their beliefs. It fuels the construction of monuments meant to resist erosion, writing systems meant to resist forgetting, rituals meant to resist cultural drift. It also introduces a new form of ambition, the desire to shape history. Leaders begin thinking not just of survival, but of legacy. Cities compete not just for resources, but for glory. Empires emerge, driven by visions of dominance that stretch beyond borders. These ambitions fuel both creativity and destruction. They give rise to monumental architecture, complex laws, and artistic masterpieces. They also unleash wars of unprecedented scale. Through it all, culture evolves at a speed evolution cannot match. And so the ancient human body marches forward, unchanged, into a world of increasingly sophisticated systems. By the end of this era, humanity has become a species living simultaneously in two worlds: the biological world shaped by evolution and the cultural world shaped by imagination. These two worlds will continue to diverge, creating tensions that will define the future, tensions between instinct and ideology, between the body's needs and society's demands, between ancient biology and modern complexity. But those tensions also define humanity's greatest strength, the ability to adapt not through genes, but through ideas. And in the millennia that follow, those ideas will transform the world more dramatically than any volcano, flood, or ice age ever did. By the time humanity crossed the threshold into the Iron Age and the dawn of classical civilizations, the world had become almost unrecognizable compared to the landscapes that once shaped our earliest ancestors. Cities rose like living monuments. Empires stretched across continents. Philosophers contemplated the nature of existence. Engineers carved roads across mountains and built aqueducts that defied distance. Sailors mapped coasts they had never seen, and traders linked civilizations that spoke languages the other could not understand. Yet beneath all this astonishing transformation, one truth remained unchanged: the human body, the physical vessel carrying the dreams, fears, and ambitions of a species now reshaping the entire planet, was still the same ancient form forged in scarcity, molded in fire and ice, and frozen in its evolutionary design tens of thousands of years earlier. This static form now walked through worlds evolution could never have predicted: stone avenues lit by torches, libraries filled with scrolls, marketplaces brimming with exotic goods, courts where laws were debated and justice enacted. The body had not evolved to sit in marble chambers, to write on papyrus, to lead armies across deserts, or to preside over rituals meant to bind empires together. But culture, as always, filled the gap. Human societies constructed systems, political, economic, philosophical, technological, that carried the mind far beyond anything the body could have achieved on its own. Imagine standing within one of the great emerging capitals of this era. The city hums with energy. Children dart between vendors selling fish, bread, wine, and spices. Scribes sit beneath shaded awnings, transcribing contracts and copying sacred texts. Soldiers march in formation, armor glinting beneath the sun. Priests chant prayers to gods whose temples dominate the skyline. Scholars debate the motion of stars, the nature of virtue, the structure of reality. Everything, the architecture, the rituals, the philosophy, reflects a mind reaching beyond the world it inherited, creating a new one in its place. This age is marked by the rise of complex political systems: monarchies, republics, councils, senates. People begin organizing themselves not just around families or tribes, but around abstract ideas: citizenship, justice, governance, equity, divine mandate. These concepts require a level of cognitive abstraction unparalleled in earlier ages. To participate in a society governed by law rather than kinship, people must understand themselves as part of a collective identity, something larger than personal relationships. This shift does not change the body, but it changes the mind's architecture profoundly. The emergence of law is one of the most important developments of this period. Laws codify expectations, rights, responsibilities, punishments. They externalize morality. They transform justice from personal vengeance into structured procedure. Written laws become anchors of order, symbols that transcend individual rulers and establish continuity across generations. This continuity is crucial for societies expanding in size and complexity. A rule remembered is fragile. A rule written is powerful. Yet laws also introduce a new dynamic: the tension between personal freedom and collective responsibility. People must now navigate systems that restrict individual desires in favor of communal harmony. This tension becomes a defining feature of civilized life. It appears in debates among philosophers, in conflicts between rulers and citizens, in reforms and revolutions. But through all of it, the ancient body remains the same, pulled between instinct and ideology. Philosophy emerges as another transformative force. In several regions across the world, Greece, India, China, the Middle East, thinkers begin articulating systems of ethics, logic, metaphysics, and political theory that will shape civilization for millennia. These philosophies explore the nature of the soul, the meaning of justice, the purpose of suffering, the structure of the cosmos. They challenge traditional beliefs and force societies to confront conflicting interpretations of truth. Writing preserves these ideas, allowing them to circulate, inspire, and provoke. The human mind becomes increasingly self-aware. It analyzes its own thoughts. It questions tradition. It imagines possibilities not grounded in immediate experience. This reflexive consciousness represents a monumental cognitive leap, one that had no evolutionary precedent. The body did not gain new organs or capabilities to enable this leap. It happened through culture, through education, debate, and the externalization of knowledge in text. Meanwhile, technological innovations continue reshaping human societies. Iron tools make agriculture more efficient and warfare more lethal. Roads connect cities across vast distances, enabling rapid movement of armies and goods. Ships grow larger and sturdier, allowing maritime trade networks to span oceans. These technologies compress space and time. A person can now travel farther in weeks than their ancestors could have in years. Ideas can spread across continents in a single generation. But these advances bring new pressures. Cities grow denser. Disease spreads faster. Class divisions sharpen. Armies grow larger and deadlier. Empires rise and fall with increasing velocity. The pace of cultural evolution accelerates, while the biological form carrying it remains anchored in the deep past. This mismatch becomes increasingly visible as societies face challenges that biology never prepared them for: economic crises, political corruption, urban crowding, organized warfare, environmental degradation. Humanity responds not with evolutionary change, but with innovation. Administrative systems grow more sophisticated. Architecture becomes monumental. Writing evolves into literature, history, philosophy. science emerges as a systematic attempt to understand the world through observation and reasoning. Mathematics advances. Astronomy reaches new precision. Medicine becomes more empirical. Each step takes the mind farther from the simplicity of its origins. Even religion evolves. Instead of local spirits tied to rivers, mountains, and forests, societies embrace complex pantheons, codified doctrines, and universal moral systems. New religions arise that emphasize ethical conduct, salvation, cosmic order, and human purpose. These belief systems shape human identity as profoundly as any technological innovation. They offer meaning, structure, and emotional anchoring in a world growing ever more complex. But belief systems also introduce conflict. Competing doctrines collide. Empires clash over territory and ideology. Wars become ideological as much as material. The human mind, capable of imagining gods, justice, and destiny, is also capable of imagining enemies, heretics, and threats that exist more in concept than in reality. Yet this, too, is not biological aggression. It is cultural cognition. The mind constructs narratives, and people act within them. One of the most profound transformations of this era is the emergence of historical consciousness. Societies begin documenting their past systematically. Chronicles, annals, genealogies, myths reconciled into narrative frameworks. People come to understand themselves as part of a long story shaped by ancestors and shaping descendants. This awareness alters behavior. It fuels ambition and caution, pride and humility. It drives rulers to build monuments meant to outlast their lives. It inspires writers to preserve ideas for future generations. History becomes a mirror in which civilizations see themselves reflected. Sometimes they admire the reflection. Sometimes they fear it. At the same time, science begins taking shape, not yet in the modern sense, but as an attempt to explain natural phenomena without relying solely on myth. Thinkers classify plants and animals, study motion and geometry, observe eclipses, seek to understand illness. These pursuits mark a shift from interpreting the world symbolically to interpreting it systematically. The mind enters realms once reserved for gods. It studies the stars, measures time, calculates distance. In doing so, it expands the boundaries of human comprehension. And yet, through all this intellectual flowering, the physical human form remains frozen in its Ice Age design. Hands that once shaped stone tools now carve marble statues or press seals into clay. The brain that evolved to track gazelle migrations now calculates astronomical cycles. The muscles built for endurance now labor beneath burdens civilization has created. The mismatch grows, but culture continues to compensate. However, compensation comes at a cost. As societies grow more complex, they become more fragile. A drought can collapse an agricultural economy. A plague can empty a city. A corrupt administration can unravel a kingdom. A failure in trade networks can starve entire regions. These collapses reveal the vulnerability of systems built on cultural, not biological foundations. They remind humanity that while the mind can reshape the world, it cannot fully control it. Civilizations rise and fall, empires expand and fracture. Knowledge is gained and lost. Libraries burn, cities crumble. And yet humanity persists. Not because the body evolves to meet new challenges, but because culture adapts. When one system falls, another emerges. When one idea dies, another is born. human resilience becomes cultural rather than biological. This resilience is rooted in imagination. Imagination allows people to see beyond crisis, to rebuild, to reinvent. It allows them to conceive of futures that differ from their past. It allows them to transform ruins into foundations. And so humanity enters a new phase, one defined not by the rise of cities or the invention of writing, but by the accelerating pace of cultural innovation. Ideas multiply, technologies evolve, philosophies deepen, trade expands. The world becomes more interconnected, more interdependent, more vulnerable, and more creative than ever before. By the end of this era, humanity stands at a crossroads. The ancient body carries a mind capable of reshaping continents, mastering metals, decoding the stars, debating ethics, recording history, organizing empires. But beneath this astonishing capacity lies a paradox. The same brain capable of philosophy is also vulnerable to fear, bias, and myth. The same creativity that builds monuments builds weapons. The same ambition that produces art produces conquest. The story of humanity is not one of steady progress or inevitable destiny. It is the story of a species whose physical evolution froze while its cultural evolution exploded. Everything that defines civilization, writing, law, philosophy, science, religion, art, governance, trade, emerged not from biological change, but from the restless mind seeking meaning in a world it was never fully built for. This is the legacy of the bottleneck, the result of a lineage that survived catastrophe only to reshape the earth. The body remains the fossil of that ancient survival. The mind remains the engine of transformation, and the tension between the two, static biology and dynamic culture, will continue shaping humanity's future long after empires crumble and new worlds rise in their place. Humanity became the architect of its own reality, and the story has only begun.